There's an abandoned place called the Royal Hawaiian Motel, and it's been deserted for over a decade. I often do solo urban exploration, sometimes even at night. This motel is located in Baker, California, where daytime temperatures can get unbearably hot, so I chose to visit it at night. It was easy to access. I parked by the road and walked over without having to deal with fences or security. It's one of the simplest places I've explored so far. There was a deep pool in the back, covered in graffiti. As I shone my flashlight on the motel, I noticed that many of the upstairs rooms had their doors slightly open or shattered, which gave off an eerie vibe, though it wasn't surprising since the place had been abandoned for so long. Some parts of the motel had also been burned in a fire. It was quiet outside, with no traffic sounds, only the crunch of debris under my shoes. At one point, I heard a woman's voice nearby, and it made my blood run cold. My first thought was that it might be security or someone looking for trouble, so I quickly hid, as I often do in these situations. I dashed into one of the lower rooms and turned off my flashlight. After waiting for a minute in silence, I turned the light back on. The room was filled with graffiti, with only a broken-down dresser and a filthy mattress inside. I wondered if homeless people ever stayed here, but given the remote location, it seemed unlikely. I continued exploring and peered into other rooms, all of which were similar, filled with graffiti and broken furniture. Suddenly, I heard something fall from upstairs. My heart raced. I went outside and pointed my flashlight at the upper walkway. I decided to check out the rooms up there, thinking it could be an animal, though there's always a chance of running into another explorer or even a homeless person. As I explored the upper floor, I heard a slow, rhythmic banging noise. It grew louder as I approached one of the rooms. I stopped outside the door, and the noise stopped too. I assumed whoever was inside had heard me. I announced that I was just an explorer and meant no harm. Peeking inside with my flashlight off, I could barely make out a figure near the back wall. The room smelled awful, like filth. I turned my flashlight back on, cautiously pointing it towards the floor. As I slowly raised the beam, I saw two pale, bare feet rushing toward me. In a split second, I illuminated the figure. It was a woman with a bloodied forehead and something yellow around her mouth open in a grotesque way. It was like a nightmare. I ran as fast as I could, hearing her scream and chase after me. I managed to escape back to my car and wasn't followed. I called my friend George, who also enjoys urban exploration. I had originally invited him to join me, but he couldn't make it. I told him what had happened, and we agreed that the banging sound I heard was probably the woman hitting her head against the wall, which explained her injuries. I briefly considered calling the police, but George reminded me that it would mean admitting to trespassing. I drove around the nearby area, looking for a payphone to anonymously report the woman. But payphones are a thing of the past. In the end, I called a non-emergency number and reported the woman, claiming I wasn't the one who found her. I don't know if the police ever investigated, but she clearly needed help. Let me know if the text is good to go, and we can proceed to the next stage. I couldn't shake the image of the woman from my mind. The hollow look in her eyes, the blood streaking down her face. It was haunting. Even though I had called the non-emergency line, I felt a creeping guilt. Should I have stayed to help her? But the way she had charged at me, the primal scream that followed, it wasn't normal. There was something deeply wrong with her, something beyond just physical injury. For the next few days, I couldn't focus. Everything reminded me of that night. The way the shadows danced in the corners of my apartment, the sound of the wind howling like it did through the empty corridors of the motel. I avoided talking about it with anyone besides George, not wanting people to think I'd lost my mind. One evening, as I scrolled through an online forum for urban explorers, I came across a thread about the Royal Hawaiian Motel. I froze. Most of the posts were about its history, how it used to be a popular stop for travelers on the way to Las Vegas, how it fell into disrepair after a series of financial issues. But then there were rumors, ones I hadn't heard before. Stories about strange sightings. A woman seen wandering the grounds at night, dressed in rags, her face smeared with something dark. Some people claimed she was a former resident who had gone mad after her family perished in a fire at the motel. Others said she was a ghost, forever trapped in the decaying walls of the Royal Hawaiian. My stomach churned as I read on. One post described an encounter eerily similar to mine. A lone explorer hearing banging noises and finding a woman with a bloodied face. The person wrote that after their encounter, they started receiving strange phone calls at odd hours of the night. The calls would consist of silence or distant, raspy breathing. I glanced at my phone, half expecting it to start ringing at that moment. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of my apartment made me jump, but it wasn't just fear that kept me awake. It was curiosity. I needed to know more. Who was this woman? Was she real, or was there something supernatural going on at that motel? The next day, I decided to go back. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't just leave it alone. I convinced George to come with me this time. "We'll be prepared," I said, "and we won't stay long, just enough to see if there's any truth to those stories." Reluctantly, George agreed. We packed flashlights, a couple of cameras, and even some basic first aid supplies, just in case. The drive out to Baker felt longer than it had the first time, probably because I couldn't shake the growing knot in my stomach. When we arrived at the motel, the air was unnaturally still. No wind, no sound, just an oppressive silence hanging over the place. George and I made our way through the broken gates and into the courtyard. The pool, still covered in graffiti, looked more sinister under the moonlight. George was tense, his eyes darting around, scanning for any movement. We decided to head straight for the upper floor, the scene of my first encounter. As we ascended the stairs, the wood creaked beneath our feet, each step making my heart race. George tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but neither of us laughed. We explored the rooms one by one, finding nothing but the same trashed furniture and graffiti. But when we reached the room where I had seen the woman, the air felt different, heavier. The smell of decay was still there, though faint. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from down the hall. George and I froze. It was the same rhythmic banging noise I had heard before. We exchanged nervous glances, then cautiously moved toward the sound. My flashlight flickered as we approached the last room at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and the banging continued from inside. I steeled myself, pushed the door open, and shone my flashlight inside. The beam caught something. Someone, at the far end of the room, hunched over, their back turned to us. The rhythmic noise was the person hitting their head against the wall, slowly, methodically. "Hello?" George called out, his voice shaky. The figure stopped, but didn't turn around. My throat tightened. I could feel George tensing beside me. The figure slowly rose to its feet, still facing the wall. Then, without warning, it spun around. It was the same woman. Her face was even more bloodied than before, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. The yellow substance around her lips seemed to glow in the dim light. Before either of us could react, she let out a bone-chilling scream and charged at us, faster than any human should be able to move. George yelled and pulled me back as we both stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind us. We didn't stop running until we were outside, panting and wide-eyed. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the car keys. Once we were safely inside the car, George and I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" George finally whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever was haunting that motel wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her chasing after us, but the road behind us was empty. That night, I decided I was done with urban exploration. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and the Royal Hawaiian Motel was one of them.